The ship called Meridian's Hope flew through the dark space between stars for 3 long years, and Captain Lisa. Morgan stood on the bridge watching the screens with tired eyes but hopeful heart. Her crew had left Earth to find a new home because their old world was getting too crowded and too hot, and they needed somewhere fresh to start again. The ship held 200 people, including scientists and soldiers and farmers and engineers, and they all dreamed of finding a planet where humans could build something new. Amy Brooks was the pilot, and she was young with quick hands and sharp eyes, and she loved flying more than anything else in the whole universe. And today, she saw something on her screen that made her heart jump. A planet appeared before them, covered in green forests and silver mountains and blue oceans, and it looked perfect, like something from an old fairy tale that people told their children. Before bed, Captain Morgan gave the order to scan the planet, and the crew worked fast, checking the air and water and soil, and everything came back good and safe and wonderful. Kate Sullivan was the science officer, and she studied life forms, and she got very excited when the scans showed plants and animals and flowing rivers, and she wanted to land right away. But then Amy saw something that should not be there, and she called out to the captain, and everyone looked at the main screen. Flying around the tallest mountain was a creature that looked like the dragons from ancient human stories, with scales that shined like stars and wings so big they could cover a whole city. On top of the dragon sat a figure wearing armor that seemed to grow from metal that was alive somehow, and the figure had long silver hair that moved in the wind. The crew started talking all at once, some saying they should leave right now and others saying they should try to make contact, and Captain Morgan raised her hand for silence. Kate Sullivan said that this could be the most important discovery in human history, and that they should at least try to talk to whoever was riding that dragon. Lisa Morgan thought about it for a long moment, and then nodded and ordered the ship to land in a clearing near the mountain, but far enough away to be safe if things went wrong. The landing was smooth, and Amy set the ship down gently in a field of purple grass that swayed in the breeze, and the crew prepared to go. Outside, Lieutenant Megan Price led the security team and made sure everyone had protective gear and weapons just in case. But Captain Morgan ordered them to keep the weapons hidden because they came in peace. Donnie Chen was a young engineer who fixed things on the ship, and he was not supposed to go on the first contact mission, but he begged Captain Morgan until she said yes and rolled her eyes. The crew walked out of the ship and into the alien air, which smelled like flowers and rain and something else they could not name, and the purple grass crunched under their boots. The forest around them was completely silent, like it was holding its breath and watching them and waiting to see what these strange visitors would do. Then she appeared, walking out from between the trees like a ghost made real, and everyone stopped breathing. She was tall and thin, with skin so pale it almost glowed, and her eyes were the color of violets after rain, and her silver hair fell past her waist in waves. The armor she wore was not like any metal humans knew, and it had patterns that moved and shifted like water, and it covered her from neck to boots, but still looked graceful behind her came the dragon, landing with a sound like thunder, and the ground shook, and the crew took a step back, except for Danny, who stood still. The dragon was even more beautiful, up close, with scales that looked like they held galaxies inside them, and eyes that were wise and old and knowing. The woman said nothing and just looked at them with an expression that was hard to read, and she seemed sad and lonely and far away, even though she stood right there. Captain Morgan stepped forward and raised her hand in greeting and spoke slowly, saying that they came from Earth and meant no harm and wanted to be friends. The woman tilted her head slightly but still said nothing, and the dragon behind her made a low sound like singing stones. Kate Sullivan tried next using a device that translated languages, but the woman showed no reaction and just kept watching them. With those violet eyes, the crew started to feel nervous because the silence went on too long, and some wondered if she could even understand them, or if she was going to attack. Then Danny Chen, who was always awkward and never knew the right thing. Tusei stepped forward without thinking, and his heart was beating so fast he thought everyone could hear. Eth looked at the woman, really looked at her, and saw past the armor and the dragon and the otherworldly beauty, and he saw someone who was alone and had been alone for a very long time. The words came out before he could stop them, and he said, "You are beautiful," and his voice cracked a little because he was nervous. Everyone froze, and Megan Price put her hand on her hidden weapon, and Amy Brooks made a small sound of alarm, and Kate Sullivan looked like she might faint, but then something amazing happened. The woman who had been so still and cold like a statue made of ice suddenly changed, and her eyes went wide and her lips parted. Slightly color rose in her pale cheeks like dawn breaking over snow, and it was pink and soft and so very human, and she blinked several times like she had forgotten how for. Just a moment the mask fell away, and she looked young and surprised and vulnerable, and then she caught herself, and the blush remained, but she straightened. Her shoulders she spoke, and her voice was like music played on instruments that humans had never heard, and she said her name was Alendra, and that she was the last guardian of this place. The crew relaxed a little, and Captain Morgan started to ask questions about the planet and whether humans could stay here and build a homey Alendra. Listened and seemed to consider, and her dragon, which she called Starweaver, moved closer and sniffed at the humans with curiosity. Donnie stayed near Alendra, and he could not stop looking at her. And she kept glancing at him with an expression that might have been confusion, or might have been something else. Just when it seemed like things might work out, the sky suddenly filled with warning lights and alarms. Started screaming from the ship. May Brooks ran back to check the sensors. And then her face went white, and she shouted that ships were coming, lots of them. And they were big, and they were coming fast. Alendra. The expression changed completely, and the softness disappeared and was replaced by something hard and cold and ancient. She spoke one word that the translator could not understand, but everyone knew. It meant danger, and Starweaver roared, and the sound shook the trees. The sky above them began to darken, not with clouds, but with massive ships that looked like they were made from metal and flesh combined, and they blotted out the soon. A voice boomed across the planet, speaking in a language that the translator worked on, and finally said, "Surrender the elf, and you humans will live. Refuse, and you will die with her captain." Morgan looked at Alendra, and then at her crew, and then back at the ships above, and she made a decision that would change everything. She activated her communication device and spoke, clearly saying that humanity did not abandon friends, and that they would stand with Alendra, no matter what. Alendra stared at the captain like she had never seen anything like this before, and her eyes became bright, and Danny thought she might cry, but she did not. Instead, she nodded once and raised her hand, and Starweaver spread his wings, and light began to gather around them. Both the first blast came from the sky, aimed at the human ship, and everyone thought they were about to die, but then a shield of pure energy appeared above them. Alendra stood with her hand raised, and power flowed from her and Starweaver, and the blast hit the shield and scattered into harmless sparks. She looked at Captain Morgan, and for the first time, she smiled just a little, and she said that perhaps she had been alone long enough. The battle was about to begin. The Korathi ships filled the sky like locusts made of metal and darkness, and their leader was a warlord named Azar, who had hunted Alendra across the stars for 30 years. Voice came through the communication systems again, and this time she spoke directly to Captain Morgan, saying that humans were fools to protect something they did not understand. The captain stood firm and told her crew to prepare for battle, even though everyone knew they were badly outnumbered, and their small colony ship was not built for war. Alendra looked at the humans with something like wonder in her violet eyes, because in all her long life, no one had ever chosen to fight for her when they could have just walked. A waster weaver roared again, and the dragon fire began to build in his throat, glowing white-hot and ready to burn anything that came close. The first wave of Korathi fighters came screaming down through the atmosphere, and they were fast and armed with weapons that could tear through metal like paper. May Brooks ran to her fighter ship, and other pilots followed her, and they launched into the air to meet the enemy, even though their ships were smaller and weaker. Megan Price organized the ground forces and set up defensive positions around the landing site, and everyone worked together like they had trained for this moment their whole lives. Kate Sullivan took readings of the Korathi technology, trying to find weaknesses, while Dr. Helen Carter prepared the medical bay for the wounded that would surely come. Dunny Chen wanted to help, but he was just an engineer, not a soldier, and he felt useless standing there while everyone else prepared to fight. Alendra noticed him standing alone, and she walked over to him. And for the first time since they met, she really looked at him, not just glanced, but truly saw him. She asked why he had said what he said before about her being beautiful, and her voice was soft and uncertain, like she genuinely did not understand Danny. Felt his face get hot, and he stammered, trying to explain that he just said what he felt, and that sometimes the truth just comes out when you are not. Think. Yandra was quiet for a moment, and then she told him something that broke his heart. She said that she was the last of her people, and that the Korathi had destroyed her entire civilization 1,000 years ago, and she was the only survivor. She had taken a vow of silence as punishment for living when everyone else died, and she had wandered the stars alone ever since, with only Starweaver for company. Danny understood.
Then why?
She seemed so sad and so far away, and he wanted to tell her that surviving was not something to feel guilty about, but the words would not come. The battle began in earnest, and the sky filled with fire and explosions, and the sound was like the end of the world. Alindra and Starweaver launched into the air, and they moved like nothing Danny had ever seen before, like they were dancing instead of fighting. Dragon-breathed plasma that melted Korathi ships into slag, and Alindra wielded weapons made from light that cut through armor like it was nothing. In Amy Brooks led her squadron in attack patterns that confused the enemy because humans fought differently than other species, using tricks and sudden changes in direction. The Korathi were strong, but they followed rigid battle plans, and when humans did something unexpected, they took longer to adapt. Captain Morgan coordinated everything from the command center, calling out orders and moving pieces like a chess master playing against a computer, but the Korathi kept coming wave after wave, and for every ship that fell, two more took its place, and the humans began to realize they could not win this. Wokate Sullivan shouted that she found something important, and everyone who could spare attention listened. She discovered that the mountains around them were not natural but artificial, made by Alindra's people long ago, and they were actually giant weapons waiting to be activated. The mountains were made of special crystals that could focus energy and create defensive shields and shoot beams that could destroy entire fleets. Alindra heard this, and she landed near Kate and said yes, that was true, but there was a problem, and her expression became even more troubled. To activate the mountain weapons, someone had to sing the ancient songs in the old language, and Alindra had sworn never to sing again as part of her vow of silence. More than that, if she sang those songs, it might wake something else, something far worse than the Korathi that her people had sealed deep beneath the planet. Danny stepped forward again, and he looked at Alindra and said something that surprised everyone, including himself. He said that surviving was not something to apologize for, and that it was something worth fighting for, and that her people would not want her to die for nothing. He said that humans believed in second chances, and that maybe it was time for her to forgive herself and let go of the guilt she had carried for so long. Alindra eyes became bright with tears that she would not let fall, and she looked at Danny like he had just given her something precious beyond measure. Captain Morgan made the decision and said they would activate the weapons because it was their only chance, and whatever came after they would deal with. Together, Alindra nodded slowly, and her hands shook just a little, and she asked Danny to stay with her because she was afraid and did not want to be alone. Danny agreed immediately, and they went to the tallest mountain while the battle raged around them, and Starweaver flew above them, keeping watch. The climb was hard and dangerous, with explosions shaking the ground and debris falling from the sky, but they kept going. When they reached the top, Alindra stood before an ancient altar covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and then she began to sing. Her voice was unlike anything Danny had ever heard before. It was pure and clear and filled with power that made the air vibrate. Crystals in the mountain began to glow brighter and brighter, responding to her song, and energy flowed through channels carved into the rock all across the mountain range. Other peaks began to activate, and massive weapon platforms emerged from hiding places where they had slept for 1,000 years. Beams focused energy shot into the sky, cutting through Korathi ships like they were made of paper, and shields formed over the human settlement, protecting everyone below. The Korathi fleet began to falter and retreat, and for a moment it seemed like they had won, but then the ground began to shake, and not from the battle but from something deep below, and Alindra stopped singing, and her face went pale with terror. She whispered that it was awake, and that her worst fear had come true, and that the Void Herald was stirring in its prison warlord. Zara's voice came over the communications again, but this time she sounded different. Not angry, but afraid. She said that if the Void Herald escaped, it would consume everything. Korathi and human and elf alike, and that they needed to work together. To stop it, Captain Morgan did not hesitate and agreed to a temporary alliance because some threats were bigger than any war between Specious Alindra. Fell to her knees, exhausted from the singing and the fear of what was coming, and Danny caught her. Before she could collapse completely, she looked up at him and said that she was sorry for bringing this doom upon them, and that her people had died fighting this thing and failed. Danny held her shoulders gently and told her that her people fought alone, but that she had allies now, and that humans never gave up no matter how bad things looked. The medical base Starweaver lay injured from the battle, and Dr. Helen Carter worked on the dragon using human technology that had never been tested on anything like this. The dragon was dying from Korathi poison, but Helen refused to let that happen, and she pushed her team to find a solution working through the Nightali. Lindra felt Starweaver's pain through their bond, and she cried out and tried to go to him, but Danny convinced her that she needed to rest and trust the human doctor. She finally agreed and sat down heavily, and for the first time in 1,000 years, she let herself lean on someone else and accept help outside the Korathi. Ships landed and soldiers emerged, but this time they came in peace, carrying supplies and medical equipment. Humans and Korathi worked side by side, preparing for what was coming, and it was strange to see yesterday enemies become today allies. Sullivan and the Korathi scientists studied the ancient texts, trying to find a way to reseal the Void Herald before it could break free. Captain Morgan called a meeting with Warlord Zara and Alindra, and they made a plan that was desperate and dangerous, but it was the only chance they had. Someone would have to go down into the planet core, where the Void Herald was sealed and strengthened. The prison, before it could escape, Elandra said she would go because it was her responsibility, and her burden, and Starweaver would go with her if the dragon survived the night. Danny said he was going to, and when everyone protested, he said that Alindra needed someone to make sure she came back, and he was volunteering. The meeting ended, and preparations began for the most dangerous mission any of them had ever attempted. Alindra and Danny sat together in the quiet before the storm, and she told him stories of her people and what they were like before they were.
Now Danny
Listened and told her about Earth and humanity and all the foolish, brave things humans did because they did not know when to quit. She smiled at his stories, and the smile reached her eyes and made her look younger and less burdened by the weight of centuries in the medical base. Starweaver eyes opened, and Helen Carter cheered because the dragon was going to live and the human medicine had worked. The morning came too fast, and the sun rose over a planet that held its breath, waiting for what would come next, and everyone knew that today would decide if they lived or died. Captain Morgan stood before her crew and the Korathi forces, and she gave a speech about courage and sacrifice, and how sometimes strangers become family when facing impossible odds. Alindra wore her armor and stood beside Starweaver, and the dragon looked fierce and ready, despite the injuries from yesterday, and the bond between them burned bright and strong. Danny Chen checked his equipment 3 times because he was nervous and scared, but he would not back down, because someone he cared about needed him. Kate Sullivan had worked all night with the Korathi scientists, and they found ancient maps that showed a path down to the planet core through caves that glowed with strange light. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution, and Alindra and Danny and Starweaver would descend into the depths while everyone else held the surface against whatever came out. Megan Price organized the defense teams, positioning humans and Korathi together in mixed units, and it was strange seeing yesterday enemies work side by side. Made Brooks Wood led the air support, and her squadron was ready to provide cover if anything tried to stop the descent team. Dr. Helen Carter prepared emergency medical supplies and loaded them onto Starweaver back because she knew they would need them if things went wrong. Warlord Zara approached Alindra, and for a long moment, the two ancient enemies just looked at each other, and the air was thick with history and pain. Zara spoke, and her voice was different from before, less hard and more human, and she said that she had hunted Alindra because she feared what the elf represented. She had feared the end of Korathi power, and the memory of when Alindra had destroyed an entire battle fleet 30 years ago, protecting a world that was not even decent. Alindra listened and said that she understood fear, and that fear made people do terrible things, and that perhaps it was time to move past old hatreds. The two warriors clasped hands briefly, and it was not forgiveness, but it was a start, and everyone who saw it felt hope that maybe things could change. The descent began, and Alindra and Danny climbed onto Starweaver's back, and the dragon launched into the air, and then dove straight down into the massive cave entrance that Kate had found. The cave walls were covered in crystals that pulsed with inner light, and the deeper they went, the stranger everything became, and reality seemed to bend and twist. Danny held onto the harness tight and tried not to think about how far down they were going, or what waited at the bottom. Alindra was quiet, but he could feel her tension and fear, and he talked to her about silly things to help her stay calm, and she seemed grateful for the distraction. Star flew with incredible precision, avoiding obstacles and following the ancient paths that had been carved by Alindris. People long ago on the surface, the first tremors began, and the ground cracked in places, and things started to crawl out of the fissures, things that should not exist. They were creatures made of darkness and emptiness, and they had no real form but shifted and changed, and they screamed with voices that hurt to hear. Megan Price ordered everyone to open fire, and both human and Korthi weapons lit up the battlefield with explosions and energy beams, but the creatures were hard to kill because they were not really alive, and bullets and beams passed through them sometimes, and other times struck solid. Amy Brooks and her pilot strafed the creatures from above and found that concentrated fire could destroy them, but it took a lot of ammunition. Captain Morgan coordinated everything from the command center, watching multiple screens and making split-second decisions about where to send reinforcements. Sullivan analyzed the creatures and realized they were fragments of the void. Harold projections of its power, testing the defenses before the real attack. Came deep in the planet. Alindra, Danny, and Starweaver reached a chamber so vast they could not see the walls, and in the center was a swirling mass of nothing. The void, Harold, was not a physical being but a manifestation of entropy and despair, and it existed between dimensions, feeding on negative emotions. When it sensed them, it spoke not in words but in visions, and Danny saw his worst fears played out before him, seeing everyone he loved dying because he was not strong, and knew Alindra saw her people dying again and again, 1,000 years of guilt compressed into moments. And she cried out in anguish, but Starweaver roared, and the sound broke the visions like shattering glass, and the dragonfire blazed bright, pushing back the darkness. Danny grabbed Alindra's hand and held it tight, and he told her that the visions were not real and that they were still alive and still fighting. She looked at him with tears streaming down her face, and she said that she could not do this, that the weight was too much, and that she was not strong enough. Danny did something that surprised both of them, and he pulled her close and held her and said that she did not have to be strong all the time, and that was why she had friends. Know something in his words or his touch, or maybe just the simple human warmth, broke through her ancient sorrow, and she took a shaking breath and straightened. She began to sing again, but this time was different. Not a song of binding or duty, but a song of hope and life and all the beautiful things worth fighting forth. Void Harold recoiled because hope was poison to it, and it could not feed on joy or love or the stubborn refusal to give up. Danny remembered something and pulled out his communication device and played music from Earth, songs about never surrendering and fighting for what you believe in. The combination of Alindra's ancient magic and human music created something new, something the Void Herald had never encountered before. On the surface, everyone fighting felt the change, and new strength flowed through them, and the creatures began to weaken and fall back. Warlord Zara noticed it too, and she ordered her forces to join their voices with the humans, and together they roared defiance at the darkness inside. The chamber Starweaver added his voice, and the dragon's song harmonized with everything else, creating a symphony of resistance. The Void Herald screamed with fury and threw everything it had at them, but Alindra stood firm, and Danny stayed beside her, and they did not break. She sang the words of sealing and the ancient prison began to reform stronger than before, reinforced by the combined will of three species working together. Entity fought back, trying to show them more visions, trying to break their spirits, but Alindra had learned something important from the humans. She had learned that even in the darkest moments, you could choose to laugh and to hope and to believe that tomorrow might be better. Dunny told a terrible joke right in the middle of the cosmic horror about his first date and how badly it went, and Alindra could not help it. She laughed. The sound of her laughter was bright and clear and completely unexpected, and the Void Herald froze in confusion, because laughter made no sense. Here, how could anyone laugh when facing oblivion, when staring into the abyss, when everything seemed hopeless? But that was the thing about humans, and now about Alindra too. They laughed because things were hopeless. They laughed in the face of fear. Sealing completed, and the prison lock tight reinforced. By the power of three species, and by something the Void Herald could never understand. Joy Alindra collapsed, and Danny caught her, and Starweaver quickly flew them back up toward the surface as the chamber began to collapse behind them on the surface. The creatures dissolved into nothing, and the tremors stopped, and everyone stood in shocked silence before erupting into cheers. Zamie Brooks whooped over the communications, and Megan Price hugged the nearest soldier, who happened to be Corathy, and did not even care. Captain Morgan allowed herself a smile and ordered medical teams to prepare for the descent team return when Starweaver burst out of the cave entrance. Everyone cheered louder, and the dragon landed gently despite his exhaustion. Helen Carter and her team rushed forward to check on Alindra and Danny, and both were exhausted but alive. And Alindra opened her eyes and looked around at all the faces, human and Corathy, looking at her with respect and relief and something like affection. She had spent 1,000 years alone, carrying guilt and sorrow, and believing she did not deserve happiness or companionship. But these people had fought for her and with her, and they had shown her that surviving was not a sin, but a gift. Warlord Zara approached, and this time she knelt before Alindra and spoke words of apology and respect. She said that the Corathy had been wrong to hunt her, and that she now understood what Alindra had been protecting all this time. Alindra helped her stand and said that perhaps they could build something new together, a future where old enemies became allies. The celebration lasted through the night with humans and Corathy sharing stories and food and beginning to learn about each other. Donnie sat with Alindra away from the crowds, and they watched the stars together, and she told him that he had saved her not just from the Void Herald, but from herself. He said that she had saved him too, by showing him that even the most ancient and powerful beings needed friends and kindness. She smiled, and it was not the sad, distant smile from before, but something real and warm and full of possibilities. Starve dozed nearby and occasionally opened one eye to watch them, and the dragon seemed content for the first time in centuries. Tomorrow, the Corathy would leave and begin the journey back to their empire with a new perspective and new allies. The weeks after the battle were strange and busy as humans and Corathy worked together to make sure the Void Herald prison would hold forever. Kate Sullivan spent her days studying the ancient texts with Alindra, learning about technology and magic that predated human civilization by thousands of years. The elf princess was patient and kind as a teacher, and she seemed to enjoy sharing knowledge. After spending so long with no one to teach, Danny became the unofficial liaison between Alindra and the human colony, and he helped translate not just words, but intentions and cultural differences. Captain Morgan met with Warlord Zara several times to establish formal treaties and agreements, and both leaders knew they were making history. Corathy Empire had never allied with anyone before, and this partnership would change the political landscape of the entire galaxy. Brooks and the other pilots trained with Corathy fighters, learning new tactics and teaching their own, and they found common ground in their love of flying. Megan Price helped establish security protocols that combined human flexibility with Corathy discipline, and the result was surprisingly effective. Helen Carter studied Starweaver with the dragon permission and learned things about biology that would advance human medicine by decades. The dragon and the doctor became unlikely friends, and Starweaver would sometimes visit the medical bay just to see what interesting things Helen was working on. Alindra began to change in small ways that most people did not notice, but Danny saw everything. She smiled more easily now and laughed at jokes, even the bad ones, and she seemed lighter. Somehow, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The guilt that had defined her for a millennium was not gone completely, but it no longer controlled her every moment. She still had nightmares about her people dying, but now when she woke, Danny was often there and he would sit with her until the fear passed. The human children were fascinated by Alindra and Starweaver, and they had no fear, only curiosity and wonder. Shit would tell them stories about the old days and about worlds they had never seen, and they would listen with wide eyes. One little girl named Lily asked if Alindra was a princess like in the fairy tales, and Alindra did not know how to answer Denny. Yes, she was. But she was the kind of princess who fought monsters and saved planets, not the kind who waited in towers. Lee thought that was much better and said she wanted to be that kind of princess too when she grew up. The Korathi prepared to leave after the treaties were signed, and Warlord Zara took Danny aside for a private conversation. She told him that he had done something remarkable by seeing past Alindra's power to the person underneath. Shtay said that the Korathi valued strength above all else, but humans had taught her that there were different kinds of strength: the strength to be kind when it would be easier to be cruel, and the strength to hope when everything seemed hapless. Shara told Danny to take care of Alindra because the universe needed people like her and people like him who reminded everyone what was worth fighting for. When the Korathi ships lifted off, the humans waved goodbye, and it felt strange to be sad seeing them go. When weeks ago they had been enemies, Captain Morgan called a meeting to discuss the colony future, and everyone agreed they would stay on this planet and make it their new home. They would call it Haven because it was a safe place in a dangerous universe, and because it represented hope for a better future. Alindra offered to help build the colony using her knowledge of the planet and the ancient technology hidden in the mountains. She showed them how to tap into the crystal power safely for energy and how to grow crops that would thrive in the alien soil. Kate Sullivan was like a kid in a candy store, learning new things every day and taking notes that would fill libraries. Emmy Brooks mapped the entire planet from the air with Starweaver help, and they found ruins of ancient cities and temples and wonders beyond imagination. The colony began to grow and prosper, and more ships came from Earth bringing new settlers and supplies and hope for the future. Donnie continued to work as an engineer, but he also spent more and more time with Alindra, learning about her culture and sharing his own. They would walk through the purple grass fields and talk about everything and nothing, and the silence between them was comfortable. Starweaver would fly overhead, sometimes close and sometimes far, but always watching over them with protective care. One day Alindra took Danny to a special place, hidden the valley where her people had built a memorial to those who died fighting the Void Herald. The memorial was beautiful and sad at the same time, with crystal statues of warriors and scholars and children frozen in time. Alindra stood before it for a long time, not speaking, and Danny did not rush her, just stood beside her and waited. Finally, she said that for 1,000 years she came here to apologize and to promise she would never forget, and to swear she would make their sacrifice mean something. But now she realized that the best way to honor them was not to mourn forever, but to live and to find joy and to build something new. She said that her people would have wanted her to be happy and to share their knowledge with others and to not waste the life they had given her. Danny agreed and said that the best way to remember the dead was to make sure their legacy lived on through actions. Not just Sora. Walandra turned to him, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling too, and she thanked him for helping her understand that they stood there together as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any human language. When they walked back to the colony, she took his hand, and neither of them said anything about it, but both knew it meant something. Captain Morgan noticed, and she smiled because she had hoped this would happen, and she thought they were good for each other. Kate Sullivan teased Danny about it, and he turned red and stammered, but he did not deny anything. Megan Price said that if he hurt Alindra, she would throw him out of an airlock, and everyone knew she was only half joking. Helen Carter just laughed and said it was about time because the tension had been obvious to everyone. Except apparently Danny, and Alandrathi colony held its first official celebration marking 3 months since landing, and everyone contributed food and music and stories. Humans taught the others earth dances and songs, and it was chaotic and joyful. And perfectly imperfect Alindra watched from the side, at first uncertain about joining in, but Lily grabbed her hand and pulled her into the dance. She was stiff at first, not used to such casual physical contact, but then she let herself relax and move with the music. Danny watched her dance and thought she had never looked more beautiful, not because of her otherworldly features, but because she looked happy when the dance ended. She came to him breathless and laughing, and said that human celebrations were very strange but also wonderful. He agreed and asked if she wanted to dance with him, and she said yes. They were both terrible dancers and kept stepping on each other's feet, but it did not matter because they were laughing too hard to caress their weaver. Watched from nearby and made a sound that might have been dragon laughters. The celebration wound down, and people began to drift away. Danny and Alindra found themselves alone again, sitting on a hill overlooking the colony. She told him that when she first saw the humans land, she had planned to send them away because she did not want company. She had been alone so long that loneliness felt normal, and the idea of letting anyone close was terrifying. But then he had said she was beautiful, and something in her had cracked open, and light had gotten in. Danny said that he almost did not come on the first contact mission, and if he had stayed on the ship, he never would have met her. They both thought about how random and unlikely it was that they had found each other across light years of space and through war and danger. Alindra said that maybe it was not random, and that maybe the universe had a way of bringing people together when they needed each
other. Most Danny
did not know if he believed in fate, but he believed in this moment and in the person sitting beside him. He told her something he had been thinking about for weeks, and he said that he was glad she existed and that the universe was better with her in it. She looked at him with those violet eyes bright with emotion, and she said that no one had ever said anything like that to her before. Then she did something that surprised them both, and she leaned over and kissed him softly and quickly, like she was afraid she might change her mind. Danny froze for a second and then kissed her back in time. Seemed to stop when they pulled apart. She was blushing furiously and looking anywhere but at him, and he was grinning like an idiot. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars and holding hands, and both thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth keeping. Captain Morgan watched from a distance and made a note to update the colony records because this was definitely going in the history books. The awkward engineer and the ancient princess, an unlikely love story that would be told for generations. Kate Sullivan was already planning to write a paper about cross-species cultural exchange and emotional bonds. Megan Price was happy for them, but also already planning what she would say if Danny needed the shovel talk. Dr. Helen Carter just smiled because she had seen this coming from day one, and she was glad to be right. The colony slept peacefully that night under alien stars, with a dragon keeping watch and an elf princess who had finally found a home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adventures, but tonight was perfect, just as it was. 1 year had passed since the humans first landed on Haven, and the colony had grown from 200 people to over 1,000, with more arriving every month. The settlement spread across the purple grass fields with buildings that mixed human architecture and ancient elf designs, creating something new and beautiful. Alindra had become an integral part of the community, teaching and helping, and finally allowing herself to belong somewhere. Her relationship with Danny had deepened slowly and carefully, like two people learning a new language together. They still had moments of awkwardness, because she was thousands of years old, and he was barely 30, and sometimes the cultural gap felt enormous, but they worked through it with patience and humor and a willingness to try even when things were difficult. Starwev had become the unofficial mascot of Haven, and children would wave at the dragon as he flew overhead, and he seemed to enjoy the attention. The dragon had even learned some human words, though his pronunciation was terrible, and it made everyone laugh when he tried to say, "Hello, Captain." Morgan had been promoted to governor, and she ran Haven with wisdom and fairness, balancing the needs of different groups and planning for the future. Kate Sullivan had opened an academy where humans could learn about alien cultures, and where Alindra taught classes about ancient history and technology. Brooks had trained a whole new generation of pilots, and they patrolled Haven skies keeping watch for threats that never came. Korathi kept their word and had become trading partners and even friends in ships. Arrived regularly carrying goods and messages. Warlord Zara had visited twice, bringing gifts and news from across the galaxy, and each time she seemed surprised that the Alliance held strong. Other alien species had heard about Haven, and some came to visit, curious about the planet where 3 species had worked together to defeat an ancient evil. Megan Price ran security, but mostly she dealt with minor disputes and the occasional wild animal that wandered too close to the settlement. Dr. Helen Carter had expanded the medical facilities, and she worked on projects that combined human medicine with knowledge. From multiple species, the colony prospered and grew and became known across the galaxy as a place of hope and cooperation. But Alindra still had nightmares. Sometimes about the Void Herald and about her people, and Danny would hold her until the fear passed. She worried that the seal would not hold forever, and that someday the entity would break free, and she would have to fight it again. Always told her that when that day came, if it ever came, she would not face it alone. The anniversary of first contact was approaching, and Captain Morgan decided to hold a major celebration. Inviting representatives from allied species ships began arriving, bringing diplomats and traders and curious visitors who wanted to see the legendary haven. Celebration planning was chaos, with humans and various aliens all having different ideas about what made a good party. Lily, who was now 8, had appointed herself as Alindra's assistant and followed the elf princess everywhere, asking endless questions, was patient with the child, and seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, and Danny thought she would make a good mother someday. Had not asked her about that yet because they were still figuring out their relationship, and he did not want to rush them. Day of the celebration arrived, and Haven transformed into a festival ground with music and food and decorations from a dozen different cultures. Danny had been working on a surprise for Alindra, and he had recruited Kate and Amy and others to help. He had found recordings of ancient elf music in the archives, and human musicians had learned to play it, combining it with earth instruments. When Alindra heard the music, she stopped in her tracks, and tears filled her eyes because she had not heard these songs in 1,000 years. She thought they were lost forever, but here they were played by humans who had learned them. Just to honor her people, Danny appeared beside her and took her hand and asked if she liked it. She could not speak for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion, and then she threw her arms around him and held him tight. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears, and she said it was the most beautiful gift anyone had ever given her. Captain Morgan made a speech about unity and cooperation, and about how Haven proved that former enemies could become family representatives. From the Korathi and 3 other species, spoke about the importance of the Alliance and about hope for the future. Then Morgan did something unexpected, and she called Alindra and Danny to the stage. She announced that Haven needed official ambassadors to represent the colony interests to other species. She appointed Alindra as the first ambassador of cultural exchange and Danny as ambassador of diplomatic relations. Both were shocked and tried to protest, but the crowd erupted in cheers and would not let them refuse. Kate Sullivan whistled loudly, and Megan Price shouted something encouraging, and everyone clapped and stomped their feet. Alindra looked terrified, and Danny looked like he might faint, but they accepted the positions because Haven needed them. The celebration continued late into the night with dancing and music and storytelling. Children from different species played together, not caring about differences, and adults watched with hope that this generation would build a better universal. Alindra danced with Danny again, and this time they were slightly better at it, though still not great. Starweather performed aerial displays for the crowd, breathing harmless colored fire that painted the night sky. Midnight, Captain Morgan announced one more surprise, and fireworks launched into the sky, spelling out Haven Unity. Hope. Everyone watched in awe as the lights exploded overhead, and for a moment the whole colony was united in wonder. Later, when most people had gone to sleep, Danny and Alindra climbed their favorite hill and sat together watching the last of the guests depart. She told him that a year ago she could not have imagined being this happy or feeling this complete. She had spent so long believing she did not deserve happiness that she forgot What it felt like Danny said that she deserved everything good, and that he was grateful every day that he had been brave enough to speak to her. That first time she laughed and said that him calling her beautiful was the best awkward moment in history. He agreed and said he would probably spend the rest of his life being awkward. But at least now he had someone who appreciated it. She kissed him, and it was not quick or uncertain like the first time, but long and deep and full of promise. When they pulled apart, she asked him something she had been wondering. She asked if he ever regretted getting involved with someone so complicated with so much baggage and ancient trauma. Donnie looked at her seriously and said that everyone had baggage and that hers just happened to be 1,000 years old. He said that he would not trade what they had for anything easier. Because easy was boring and she was extraordinary. She laughed and called him ridiculous, and he agreed, but said that was one of his best qualities. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars, and both thinking about the future Alindra had stopped looking backward all the time and started looking forward to what might come. She told Danny that she wanted to explore the galaxy with him and show him all the wonders she had seen in her long life. He said yes immediately because adventure with her sounded perfect. They made plans to visit other worlds and meet other species and represent haven across the stars, but they would always come back here to this hill and this colony and these people who had become family star wherever landed beside them and settled down with a contented rumble. The dragon had found peace too. After centuries of wandering and fighting, Captain Morgan watched from the settlement and smiled because everything had worked out better than she could have hoped. Sullivan was already writing her next paper about long-term cross-species relationships and their impact on diplomatic relations. Megan Price had given up threatening Danny and had accepted that he was good for Alindra, and that was what mattered. Helen Carter was planning to study the biological compatibility of different species for future reference. Colony slept peacefully, knowing that their guardians watched over them down in the planet core. The Void Herald remained sealed, but it was different. Now the combined hope and joy of Haven residents had strengthened the prison beyond anything. Alindra's people had achieved a long darkness, could not thrive where there was laughter and love and stubborn refusal to give up. Donnie looked at Alindra in the starlight and thought about how random and beautiful life could be. One awkward comment, one moment of honest bravery had changed everything. She looked back at him, and her violet eyes were warm and full of emotion. The quiet princess, who had wandered alone for a millennium, had found her voice again. She had found friends and purpose and love and a place to call home. Donnie, the awkward engineer, had found someone who saw past his stumbling words to the good heart underneath. Together they had helped save a planet and forge an alliance and prove that kindness was stronger than hate. The story of Alindra and Danny would be told for generations about the elf princess and the human who saw her beauty not just on the outside but deep within, about how one moment of vulnerability led to friendship and how friendship led to love, about how the universe brought together two unlikely souls across impossible distances because they needed each other. The night grew late and the stars wheeled overhead, and still they sat together, unwilling to let the moment end. Finally, Alindra stood and pulled Danny to his feet and said it was time to go home.